I first came to this area 25 years ago, and for the past 20 years I've been working here full time. Because my PhD is in coastal ecology, I've visited coast all along the East Coast from Maine down to Florida. I've visited most of the major estuaries on the Pacific coast and birded along the Texas Gulf Coast. And so when I got here, I saw this was a salt marsh. I could tell I was in South Carolina, Georgia, but there was something different about this place. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. When I started working here full-time, I realized that when I looked across the marsh, I saw that there was no high marsh. I went, there's no high marsh. So I thought I'd solved my problem. Then Nancy Schilling comes along. Nancy is the founder of the Friends of the Rivers. The Friends of the Rivers eventually morphed into the Port Royal Sound Foundation. So in many ways, I know that Nancy is responsible for everything that's happened since then in some indirect, if not direct way. In 2000, she asked me to give a talk to the Sun City community about why the Ocoee River was unique. Nancy lives on the Ocoee River and was concerned because they'd closed the oyster beds there due to fecal coliform counts getting too high. So I had an assignment, and there was nothing published about this area. So I started talking to veterans, and there were two people I went to because they'd worked here for so long. One was Al Stokes, who everybody knows, the director of the Waddell Mariculture Center. And the other one was Russell Berry, who had run the DHEC office here for over 30 years. And I said, guys, what's going on? And they started telling me stuff. And I went, wow, this is neat. I haven't heard of this stuff in an estuary before. So I put together the Ocoee talk, and that went fine. It made me start thinking about it. Nancy said, that went so well, I want you to give a talk about this other tidal river. So now I had to give a talk on a different tidal river. And I realized, as I researched it, it was the same story. And lo and behold, every tidal river had the same story because they were all connected to a greater body called the Port Royal Sound. There was an environmental impact statement done in the early 1970s because of proposed development over at what is now Colleton River Plantation. And the title of it was Assessment of the Port Royal Sound System. And so that is really the document that was the beginning of studying this area. So it turns out that now, today, we describe this area as a world-class body of water. Why in the world would someplace that's called a world-class body of water be overlooked for so long? And I think there's several reasons. First of all, this is a relatively small area, so it can kind of be overlooked. Second, there was no research university in the beginning that was located next to it. Third, the way a body of water gets attention is if it's highly polluted, if it's a Superfund, something like that. So, you know, if it's not broken, why try to fix it? So nobody really was concerned from that standpoint. And the other factor was that when you looked at the maps of river watersheds, you know, a watershed being a region of land that drains into a common river or water body, it shows this area being part of a watershed that extends inland up past Allendale, and they call it the Salkehatchie drainage. So if you just looked at the map, it gave you the impression that the water draining from inland would just drain down through here and go to the ocean like any other river. And so nobody really paid attention to this area. Now then, so for the past 15 years, I've been asking people, what's unique about this area? And I've been trained as a scientist, but I realized, first and foremost, I'm an educator. I just like to talk too much. And so what I want to do is put together all this information that we've been gathering about what makes this area unique. So with that, where does our story begin? Well, actually, it starts about 18,000 years ago. The person who told me this was very, very old. The geologists, when they studied the coast here, know that 18,000 years ago was the peak of the last ice age. Therefore, much of the ocean's water was tied up in polar ice caps. There was less water in the ocean, and so sea level was lower. As a matter of fact, it was 350 feet lower, which meant that the coastline was 60 miles east of Hilton Head. This would have made this location here sort of being like an Orangeburg. You would have been well away from the coast. And when we look out here and look at the Broad River, this would have been a cypress tupelo swamp. People were here then, and it stayed that way. About 10,000 years ago, the polar ice caps started melting, and sea levels started rising significantly. Kept rising until about 4,000 years ago. And 4,000 years ago is when they say that sea level became relatively stable. Now, I like to remember numbers by things that happen to relate to humans. I remember 18,000 years ago because 18 is a significant year for a teenager. 13,000 years ago is, when teenagers start becoming teenagers. And 4,000 years ago is the period of tantrums, at least in my household. And that's kind of what sea level's done for the last 4,000 years ago. Geologists say it remained stable. I said, well, how stable was it? And they said, oh, it just went up and down 25, 30 feet. And so for the past 4,000 years ago, that stability has meant it's been doing this. Because it was relatively stable, that meant that the conditions were right for building barrier islands. So that's why when you look at any information about how old are barrier islands, they always say about 4,000 years because that's the right geological period. Now, during that time, for the past 4,000 years, as the sea has come and gone this 25 feet, one of the things that happened is that rising sea level flooded the entrances to these coastal rivers. And for most of them, they went far enough inland that they still had fresh water further upstream. But that was not the case for the Broad River. The Broad River was such a short tributary, it would have flown into the Savannah River, and then the Savannah River would have continued to the old shoreline, that this little river got flooded by rising tide all the way up to its headwaters. So as a result, now, as sea level rose, there was no more sediment to be washed into the upper end of the river. That meant that it differed from the other rivers nearby because, for example, the Savannah River, as sea level has risen, sediments continued to come down the river and fill in the mouth of the river. As the Combahee and the Edisto rivers, which are coastal rivers, have risen, they haven't been able to bring in as much sediment as the Savannah River because they're not as long or as large, but they've still brought in sufficient sediment that you have lots of shoals and the tidal creeks and the entrance is shallow. The Broad River, however, because it had no source of sediment, as sea level has risen, it's just gotten deeper and deeper. So it is an embayment that we use the term sometimes. It's still an estuary, but the idea is that that's why it has such deep tidal rivers and tidal creeks, and that's what sets it apart. Now, so with that, when we say what are the unique conditions that geology has put together, so to speak, to make the Port Royal Sound unique, there's 4 things we want to remember that makes it different from any other coastal estuary in the United States. First of all, it is been flooded to its headwaters by the ocean, which has resulted with no sediment being contributed as sea level rises. Therefore, we have very deep tidal rivers. That has occurred a lot on the Maine coast, but here the land is relatively flat. So the expanse of rising sea level has covered a large percent of the land, about 50% of Beaufort County is now part of the salt marsh or tidal rivers. So because of its flat terrain, you have expansive salt marshes. Thirdly, the tides. We only believe in very high-tech multimedia here. If you look at my hand, this is Florida. And we have that curve, so we talk about the fact, if you work in here, how as The gravitational pull of the moon on the ocean surface makes a bulge, and the Earth rotates through that bulge, that the amount of water within the curve of the southern coast here gets pushed into a smaller and smaller area. And that point where that water gets pushed in the most, the vertex, is right on the Georgia-South Carolina line, right at the mouth of Port Royal Sound. So we have these huge tides that are now flushing in and out through these very deep tidal rivers. And the last point is one that we often fail to mention, and that is our latitude. We are a subtropical climate located very near to the Gulf Stream. So even during winters such as this winter, when we might have an exceptionally cold winter and it kills things, we have a continual source of subtropical and tropical marine life that will be brought back up the next summer and reseed this area, so to speak, from Florida. So those things combined means that we are both an embayment, but a subtropical embayment with expansive salt marshes. So with that, you would think, looking out across this landscape, this is going to be an amazing place to see. As a first-time visitor, people kind of get here and sometimes they look across and they say, well, it's not really impressive. All I see is grass. All right? It's deceptive. That grass out there is the most productive ecosystem in the world because that grass is the only species that can grow in full-strength ocean water. And think about it, it's a perennial, which means the roots live from year to year, but everything you see above ground is that year's crop. So I want you to always think of the salt marsh as an annual crop. The growing season starts in February. It's fertilized twice a day by the rising tides, and it continues to grow all the way into early October. So what you're looking at out there is just one season's crop, now ready to be harvested by the winter storms and the really large tides. That will all be taken out, and next year, just as much grass will be grown as you see out there now. All right, so there's a huge amount of biomass that's being put into the system. The key to getting that grass back into other living organisms is by decomposition. So the two most important groups, so to speak, are bacteria and marine fungi that do the decomposition. When we look at a salt marsh, we talk about high productivity and high biodiversity, but they don't occur at the same places necessarily. Let's talk about high productivity first. One of the most obvious animals in the salt marsh are fiddler crabs. And if you go to the literature, people who study fiddler crabs, they're easy to do. You can take, this is a 1 meter square quadrat, and they can put this down and count the number of fiddler crab holes. And the number of fiddler crab holes for this size will range between 70 and 200 per meter squared. Okay, let's do some simple math. When you go to the maps, they say that there is approximately 500,000 acres of salt marsh in South Carolina, almost 500,000 acres of salt marsh in Georgia. In Port Royal Sound system, there's about 200,000 acres of salt marsh. Okay, looked up the math. There are 4,047 square meters in an acre. If we assume that there's a mere 100 fiddler crabs per meter squared, and we further make an assumption, say, of all that salt marsh out there, only 30% of it is really good fiddler crab habitat. We still come up with an estimate that we have about 24 billion fiddler crabs out there in our system alone. What are those 24 billion fiddler crabs doing? And by the way, if it turns out it's 60% of the salt marsh, then we're talking about 50 billion. So, 100% error. The point is, in every one of those squares, what are all those fiddler crabs doing? they are making burrows down into the mud. Those burrows allow the Spartina grass to get oxygen to their roots. So they're greatly enhancing the growing conditions of the Spartina grass. They are skimming the top layer of mud that's full of organic material off and consuming it, which means they're excreting nitrogen, ammonia, back into the salt marsh, which means they're fertilizing the Spartina. And they're serving as what I call the chicken nuggets of the salt marsh, because everything likes to eat them. I don't know if any of you dealt with kids or grandchildren, but it seems like they get all picky, but the one thing that they will eat are chicken nuggets, at least in my household. So at the time I was first starting to teach about the salt marsh, my kids were that age, and so that's why the fiddler crabs became the chicken nuggets of the salt marsh. So think about that much food being produced on an annual basis. Now, that's an example of high productivity. When you go into the salt marsh and you walk around, though, you may not, on a low tide, you may not see that many species. You might find half a dozen species of crabs. You might find a half a dozen different species of birds. And you might find 3 or 4, maybe, species of bivalves, clams, little mussels, etc. And so the salt marsh is not thought of as being a highly diverse ecosystem from that perspective. However, if you come back at high tide, things are different, because that salt marsh with all those organic materials, all that hiding place, all that structure and things to eat, the high productivity, means that it becomes what we call the breadbasket of our seafood industry. At least 3/4 of the species harvested as seafood in South Carolina spend at least part of their life cycle in our salt marshes. So that is why we associate these two, because most species of seafood, fish, crabs, mollusks, start as swimming larvae, and they're part of the zooplankton. So the salt marsh becomes critical for zooplankton productivity, feeding of zooplankton, feeding of small fish. And otherwise, think about what it would be like to be something that small and spend all your time out in this open water with all those other fish. So the diversity of the salt marsh is within its small size from that perspective. You can't talk about a salt marsh with also not talking about the oyster beds and the oyster reefs along the tidal creeks. And I just bring those up to show how something that brings structure also adds productivity and diversity. So quickly, I thought we'd go out and we'd count how many oysters are in an oyster reef. All right, you want to come up with a number, whether it's 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000. But keep in mind that each of the live oysters are pumping about a gallon of water an hour that they're submerged. And so now you've got the ability to harvest the productivity of the microscopic component of all this rich water that's receiving these nutrients. And the oysters are then taking that and transforming it into oyster tissue and oyster shell. As that oyster shell is being built, you now have created this metropolis for invertebrates that like to live in cracks and crevices. So if you take apart a South Carolina oyster reef, you'll find about 35 to 40 species of invertebrates that you can readily see. But if you take a microscope out, you'll find several hundred more. So that adds to the diversity as well. Now, so far we've talked about the value of the salt marsh, we've talked about the value of the oyster beds. That's true for any salt marsh along the coast of Georgia or South Carolina. For us, though, we have something that's totally distinctive, and that is those deep tidal rivers that are no longer receiving sediment and are regularly being flushed by our strong tides twice a day. And the fact that these deep tidal rivers are connected to water that is subtropical and linked through currents to Florida. Now we've added a component that makes it so our system is basically like in an inland sea. I like to talk about the fact that if you think about it like a live oak, where the roots are in the ocean, and the branches branch out across the land. So every time the tide comes in, it comes up the trunk and goes out to the tips of the branches and then retreats. Somebody with DNR says, oh, we just call it the tongue of the Atlantic Ocean. It just sticks right in there and stays there. But somehow I just don't see a poster showing that. But the point is that the broad river out here, with the water being 20 to 40 feet deep in places, means that we have what is found over your head. We have the tiger sharks, we have the sea turtles. That's why they're up here, because that is what separates us from all these other coastal salt marshes. Now, the other thing that's fascinating about this system that we really don't understand fully yet, the locals do, but it hasn't ever been researched and published on, is that in addition, in those deep waters, there's a lot of topography. There's these deep shark holes. And when you add that dimension to the Port Royal Sound system, now you have places where things can get down and survive cold weather. Things can happen that are different, and larger prey can exist. And so that adds another component to our system. I don't want you to look out there and just think of a uniform mud surface on the bottom of these tidal rivers. There's different things that are happening, particularly when tidal creeks and rivers come together and you get a swirling effect. You can get that. We still need to know more about what those holes do to the overall ecology of our system. So we've got the salt marsh, we've got the oyster beds, we've got these deep tidal rivers. Between the deep tidal rivers and the salt marsh, though, because of our huge tides, particularly at the mouth of Port Royal Sound, we have these expansive sand flats and mud flats. And now we have another component. These huge flats have high productivity with all these microscopic worms, or worms that you can just barely see, as well as very small clams. And there are birds that travel over 3,500 miles every year to come here to take advantage of that feeding. The sandpipers and the plovers are those little birds you see running across the mudflats or out of the beach. Almost all of those nest within the Arctic Circle. Many of them that come to us actually spend their summers in northern Alaska and at the Mackenzie River right between Alaska and Canada. They fly here because they want to load up and fuel. Some birds continue down into South America and spend the rest of the winter there and then stop back by here. Most of us have heard the story about the horseshoe crab and the way that during its breeding season in the spring, it produces millions of eggs, which are basically just like free handouts for any fish or bird that can get to them. What makes it so important for the shorebirds is that when these sandpipers fly to the Arctic, they have to get there right as the snow is melting, lay their eggs so that their chicks can hatch while there's still tons of mosquitoes and flies, so that they can do their feeding before the season's over. That means they have to produce their eggs, the females do, with the fuel that they got while they were down here. So their ability to breed successfully depends upon how much food they get on these southern wintering areas that they have in migration. When they leave here, they fly nonstop over 3,000 miles, ranging from 50 miles an hour to 45 miles an hour, depends on the tailwind, and they just keep flapping until they get there. They land, feed for a little bit, and then it's time to lay eggs. So the success of those breeding animals is determined by the success of the Port Royal Sound to continue to be productive. Well, with all this going on, it's not surprising that people have been attracted here. And the evidence to show that people have always been here, what I like to do is talk to people is, I say, stand on any bridge near Port Royal Sound and look out across the water and you'll see evidence of past humans. Out there we see an island. That island, again, it would be interesting to estimate how many oyster shells are there, because that island is made up of oyster shells that have been discarded. Most of them by Native Americans. There are a few places you come around they used to dump barges, but when they dumped the barges of oyster shells back in the 1920s and 30s, they'd want to get it back in the water because they knew that shell was the material that the new oyster spat or larvae would settle on. So each of these islands then has been a location where people have thrown oyster shells down as they've been eating them. Because we know that sea level's been at this area about 4,000 years, we know people have been here for 10,000 years, but it's in the last 4,000 years these oyster shells have been made. What's fun is to go to Google Earth and look around, and if you look carefully, you can find a shell ring where the shells were put down in a way that they made a circular fort, so to speak, or wall. There's one at the very west end of Dawes Island here that we could get in a boat and be at in about 15 minutes, depending upon who's driving the boat. And so the human factor is always with us. When you go to see a building that's tabby ruins, those early European colonists did not sit there and eat all those oysters. They found mounds of oyster shell that had been discarded on the shoreline and simply taken those and used those for building material. The impact of Port Royal Sound's deep harbor became very evident when the Europeans started visiting this area. Think about it. In 1492, Columbus was discovering for the second time for the Europeans the New World. And by 1521, there's documents in a journal that a Spanish ship had described what was the mouth of Port Royal Sound. By 1556, then the Europeans were back. A little dispute between the French and the Spanish, as usual. And so it was 1566 that the Spanish set up the first settlement in the New World for the Europeans' perspective. And it was from 1566 to 1587 that they had Santa Elena, which is a whole nother story to itself. I always find it interesting why people leave. And it turns out in about 1587, the English privateers, Sir Francis Drake being one of them, were really working this coast heavily. And the Spanish had decided that defending things up here just was not worth their time and effort, so they retreated further south. Again, in 1663, we had the British finally limping up here. But one of the things about the British that is important to understand what we see later is that they came to us via the Caribbean. Barbados was their major stockhold, and so that strong connection between Barbados and South Carolina is going to remain there through the Revolutionary War, influence our culture, influence our agriculture. And they decided, they sent them back and said, we want our English settlement to be in Port Royal Sound. The fellow they sent back looked up and down the coast, and it turned out there was a Kiowa cacique or chief that had a much better Chamber of Commerce approach than the ones around here. He said, no, you want to settle up here. You can do more trading with us up here. And so this little town we now call Charleston was actually established further north of here, even though it was first supposed to start here. So this sound has obviously influenced the people and who's settled and where. That brings us up to today. What's happening today? I always like to say that today we can say there's the good news and the bad news. The good news is the initial perception of that watershed map you looked at, suggesting that water flowed from inland through here to the ocean is wrong. So we have no one upstream polluting. So that's great for us. The bad news is that if it gets polluted, we can't blame anybody else. It's our problem. When people see these tides and say, oh my gosh, the tide goes up and down anywhere from 6.5 to 10 feet a day, it must be great flushing. So, if I throw something out there or if something spills out there, it'll just get flushed out of the system. It doesn't work that way because the distance from wherever it gets dropped in the water all the way out to the ocean is so far that before it moves any distance, the next tide comes back in. So really, we have to think of these short tidal rivers as kind of being almost like bathtubs. They slosh back and forth. And so if pollution gets in there, it'll take weeks for those chemicals or whatever got put into that water to get out of there. So don't let these high tides think you can rely on flushing to make a difference there. The future of Port Royal Sound is scary, quite frankly. Any coastal body that has been next to a large urban area has lost its ability to function effectively as a highly productive salt marsh. The good news for us is that those areas have been settled for long periods of time. So their sewage treatment plants, their infrastructure was all built under the old paradigm where the goal of an engineer was to get rainwater, we now call stormwater, off the land as quickly as possible so that you don't have flooding of your parking lots and all, and get it into the river. And as a result, that kind of structure has been influencing everybody else's estuaries for a long period of time. We're all relatively new development. Beaufort Jasper Water Sewer Authority has an excellent sewage treatment facility, so we're blessed with that. The local municipalities understand stormwater management, so they've put into place things that could help make it so that that stormwater with the chemicals that come off of parking lots and roads won't contaminate our tidal rivers. But that's not enough. I'll give you a couple perspectives. One of my other mentors is Dr. Jeff Scott. Dr. Scott headed up NOAA's environmental toxicology labs around the country for 20 years and then retired, and he's now, for his second career, he's now head of the Department of Environmental Science at the University of South Carolina. He has conducted and overseen multiple studies in Beaufort County. He has a special love for the Port Royal Sound. When I talked to him about parking lots, he said, don't forget, Chris, every parking lot produces carcinogens. The runoff from any of those places are carcinogenic, because I was asking him about a certain sealer. The second thing is that in natural systems, when we talk about a natural wetland, what we're talking about is a low-lying area where the water settles and stays there. And one of two things happen. Anywhere from 30 to 70% of that water in that wetland actually gets absorbed by the trees and gets sent back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. So the natural process is not for all the water to land on the ground and end up in the tidal rivers or tidal creeks. It's to get recirculated before it ever gets there. That's why it is so beneficial for neighborhoods to have swales rather than curb and gutter. So if the water sits in a ditch, and if you have the right kind of soils, you have good sandy soils, then it can be reabsorbed into the ground, or the trees can then take it up. If it gets absorbed into the ground, it moves laterally and gets filtered before it eventually percolates into the salt marsh. So the rate at which that fresh water reaches the salt marsh is much longer period than if it was runoff. The second thing is that people are relying heavily on what we call detention ponds or stormwater ponds. People don't label them that. When you develop a new residential development, they call them an amenity. It's a pond for your scenic view. Those things are there for several reasons. One, in many cases, they needed soil to build up the height of where they put the houses, so they got the dirt out of the pond. Those are the ones you have to be interested in, because some of those ponds can be 30 feet deep if they're really mining for sand. The second thing is that they were required to have stormwater retention ponds as part of the development. So they just made them part of the landscape. And of course, people will pay more money if they're looking across a water feature. For those ponds to work effectively, they have to have the capacity to receive water and hold it for a while, so that the bacteria will be killed by the UV light that enters the pond, and the water can be reabsorbed. Now, I'm in the business of working at a residential community, and I understand the logistics of what's involved there. What happens with these ponds, which are considered to be the #1 saving grace, potentially, for the Port Royal Sound is when people look out there and the pond gets low, somebody picks up the phone and calls the general manager and says, I'm looking at mud. You know, this pond is very unattractive. So you need to fill it back up with water. And so there is a strong tendency for the residents who live in these communities to have their general managers keep all their ponds full for aesthetics. As a result, when it rains, there's no detention or retention. The water goes in the pond and immediately goes out the other side. So one of the challenges of trying to work with communities is how can you plant the edges with pickerel weed, and it costs more to manage the edge of a pond that's vegetated than one that you just mow down. There's lots of challenges, but the important thing to emphasize here is that the future welfare of the Port Royal Sound Foundation is going to require that all the people who live here understand the connection between what they do and the amount of shrimp and crabs and fish found in these waters. That's why the Port Royal Sound Foundation was created, because education is the key to saving the Port Royal Sound Foundation. Now, think about what happens from the legislative standpoint. We have county council and municipal town governments that get elected every 2 years. Where are the people coming from that have the time to serve on those councils? Are often new. How many new residents a year do we get coming into Beaufort County that settle here? They're retired, they're ready to do something, they want to get on the community association board or get involved, and they're ready to make things happen. In order to get everybody to understand why Port Royal Sound is so unique and the fact it is truly a national treasure, requires that people learn about it before they move here. The Port Royal Sound has to develop a national reputation. Just like if I say Jackson Hole, people know where I'm talking about. May not have been there, but they recognize it. So one of the things that the Port Royal Sound Foundation is all about is working to have a national reputation as well as the locals know about it. Done this through the types of people we've invited to give talks here with the gala, the fact that we have Bob Ballard here, the fact that Philippe Cousteau has done at least one of his TV shows on the Port Royal Sound. Those are all helpful. What's next? I told you before there hadn't been as much research done here as other places. One of the visions for the Port Royal Sound Foundation is that across the highway there, the foundation now owns the property for a campus. And to have a place with dorms and lab facilities to do field work will mean that universities and colleges who like to take their classes to places to do winter research or summer projects would be attracted to come here and do their work here in this deep water system that's highly attractive, and as a result, publish and also bring more national attention. So with that, what we are very appreciative of is the fact that y'all are willing to be volunteers, take this message, talk to people, help people understand that what they do in their homes, in their backyards, really is what will make the difference of whether the Port Royal Sound is still healthy and functional 10 years from now, because that's the time frame we're dealing with, or whether it's going to die by 1,000 cuts, which often happens to these coastal waters. So we're optimistic. I've just been truly amazed at the kind of people that have come on the board for the Port Royal Sound Foundation. Think about it. We're not even 4 years old yet, and look and see where we are. So with that, I think we've got a great future ahead of us. We need to keep bringing in more people and have that multiplier effect. And the other thing I want you to do is to think about what would it be like if the Port Royal Sound was not healthy. Because you've got, right now, think about it. You have between 25 and 50 billion neighbors called fiddler crabs. You'll never feel alone. The fact that you can look across there and think about that rich diversity. What kind of sense of place does that give you? So with that, let's share it with everyone. Thank you.